The gallery was alive with chaos, the kind of frantic energy that made my skin crawl. Handlers wheeled in crates of sculptures and abstract paintings, their voices bouncing off the polished floors. Mr. Hastings stood in the center of it all, barking orders like a conductor leading a dissonant symphony. I adjusted my tie, the fabric stiff against my neck, and resisted the urge to roll my eyes. This wasn't the art world I had imagined back in college. I thought art was about inspiration, beauty, and truth. But now, it felt like nothing more than a game of egos and dollar signs. I sighed and turned to the collection I'd been assigned to curate, the image of God. 3 blank canvases hung evenly along the far wall, each framed in minimalist black. Their titles were stenciled in neat gold letters beneath them. The image of God, number 1, 2, and 3. Blank, all of them. Not a single brushstroke or hint of texture, just sterile, off-white nothingness. I leaned closer to one of the canvases, squinting as though staring harder might reveal some hidden detail. Nothing. Just the faint weave of the fabric, stark and empty. The audacity of it was maddening. Someone had the nerve to call these art, and worse, Hastings had greenlit them as the centerpiece of tonight's exhibit. I stepped back, crossing my arms. I wasn't just annoyed. I was offended. "Is this what we're calling art now?" I'd asked Hastings when the pieces arrived. "They're not even painted." He'd waved me off with a smirk.
You don't have to understand it. Just hang them and let the buyers do the rest.
Let the buyers do the rest. His voice echoed in my head as I stared at the canvases, anger bubbling in my chest. Hastings didn't care about art. He only cared about sales. And apparently the image of God was already generating buzz, with whispers of pre-bids coming in even before the exhibit opened. By the time the guests started trickling in, I'd plastered on the kind of fake smile that made my jaw ache. Champagne glasses clinked, voices hummed with polite interest, and I tried to focus on anything other than the absurdity of the situation. A small group clustered around the image of God, number 1, their murmurs growing louder as more people joined them. I moved closer, curiosity overriding my irritation. A woman in a tailored dress leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration.
"It's beautiful,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"The way he's smiling, it's so kind."
I froze. Kind? She had to be joking. I stared at the canvas, trying to see what she saw. Still nothing, just blank, unyielding white. Another guest chimed in, a man in a dark suit.
"But there's something unsettling about it, like he knows something we don't. Look at the eyes. They're almost glowing."
The eyes? What eyes? My heart began to race as I scanned the canvas again, searching desperately for some hint of what they were describing. But no matter how hard I looked, all I saw was emptiness. I backed away, trying to shake off the discomfort that was creeping into my chest. This was absurd. They were making it up. Or worse, caught in some kind of collective delusion. That had to be it, right? The crowd around the canvases only grew, their voices hushed but animated. Words like divine and terrifying floated through the air, each one landing in my ears like a needle. I couldn't stand it any longer. I cornered Hastings by the drinks table, my frustration boiling over. "They're all staring at blank canvases," I hissed. "Why are they pretending there's something there?" He smirked, sipping his champagne.
"Maybe they're not pretending."
I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he just walked away, leaving me alone with the hum of the crowd and the weight of my growing unease. The buzz around the image of God reached a fever pitch as the night went on. Guests whispered reverently, some even wiping tears from their eyes as they gazed at the canvases. I avoided them entirely, keeping to the far corners of the room, but I couldn't escape the words that hung in the air.
"He's so thin, but his presence is overwhelming."
"Can you see the way he's watching us?"
"He's smiling, but it's unsettling."
I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. They were insane. All of them. I didn't want to hear another word. But then Hastings announced the final sales.
$80,000 for number 1, $90,000 for number 2, and $120,000 for the last one.
My stomach churned as the room broke into polite applause. The buyers stood by their pieces, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. They'd paid small fortunes for blank canvases. They were crazy. It was insulting. But beneath my anger, a darker thought began to take root. Why can't I see it? As the night wound down and the guests filtered out, I found myself alone in the gallery, standing before the canvases. The buyers wouldn't take their pieces until the exhibit closed, so they remained on the walls, their blank surfaces staring back at me. I stepped closer to the image of God number 1, my breath hitching in my chest. The room was silent now, the hum of conversation replaced by the faint buzz of the overhead lights. My reflection stared back at me from the canvas, faint and distorted by the weave of the fabric. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the whole thing as a joke, maybe even a scam, but I couldn't shake the words I'd overheard. The eyes, the smile, presence. I reached out, my fingertips hovering just above the surface of the canvas. The air around it felt colder, and for a moment I swore I heard something, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, wiping them on my pants as if to rid myself of whatever lingering sensation the canvas had left. Its surface rippled, not like fabric, but like water disturbed from below. My pulse roared in my ears, every breath shallow and labored. The ripple expanded outward, deliberate, distorting the blankness until it wasn't blank anymore. Shadows began to shift, seeping through the edges of the canvas and curling outward, moving like smoke trapped in reverse. The blank surface folded inward, deeper and deeper, as though the canvas was no longer solid, no longer two-dimensional. It was a window or a doorway. The canvas strained, bulging as though something massive and incomprehensible was pressing against it, forcing its way into this reality. The edges of its form were indistinct, blurring and flickering like an image on an old, damaged screen. My mind struggled to hold on to what I was seeing, but every time I tried to focus on its details, they shifted, slipping out of reach. The first thing I could process was the presence. It wasn't something I saw. It was something I felt, a weight that crushed the air from my lungs. The room seemed to darken around it, the walls bending inward, shrinking under its impossible gravity. It made my stomach churn, each shift wrong. There was no sound, save for the wet, tearing noise of the canvas splitting as it gave way entirely. Shadows poured out like ink, spreading across the floor, devouring all light. The entity loomed, its form towering, its edges distorting like heat waves rising off asphalt. It was massive and insubstantial all at once, a paradox my mind couldn't reconcile. Its motion wasn't smooth, but slow, halting, as if every step dragged against the fabric of reality itself. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, unable to look away. Every instinct screamed at me to close my eyes, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked, held by a force that didn't come from me. The air grew colder as it approached, sharp and metallic, the scent burning the back of my throat. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising as though something unseen was brushing against me. Its presence grew heavier, pressing against my chest, my ribs creaking as I struggled to draw breath. And still I couldn't see it. Not fully. Every time I tried, my vision blurred, doubling and fracturing, as though my eyes themselves refused to hold the image. All I could process were fragments. Something too tall, too narrow. Movements that stuttered and jerked as though reality itself rejected its existence. The edges of its form pulsed faintly, a glow not of light, but of something more oppressive, much like staring into an inverted sun. Its approach wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. Each step, soft yet reverberating through the ground, felt inevitable. The room seemed to tilt toward it, gravity bending around its mass. I wanted to scream, but my throat was frozen, my breath caught between desperate gulps of air. It reached for me. Its hand, or what should have been a hand, hovered inches from my face. The space between us warped, The air burned cold against my skin, and the hum that had been vibrating through the room now resonated through my bones, growing louder with each passing second. When it finally brushed against my cheek, my mind shattered. It wasn't pain, it was everything. A flood of sensations, memories, and images that weren't mine. The pressure felt like my skull was being peeled open layer by layer, exposing thoughts I didn't know I'd buried. I saw light and shadow, spiraling endlessly into one another. Shapes shifted and twisted, fractals of impossible geometry that spun out of focus the moment I tried to understand them. My sense of self, the boundaries of my body, my mind, dissolved under the weight of its presence. I was nothing, only a fragment caught in the orbit of something vast and unknowable. I couldn't move, unable to scream. All I could do was let it consume me. When I woke, I was sprawled on the gallery floor, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. My clothes clung to me, soaked through with cold sweat, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Every joint ached as though I'd been crushed beneath a tremendous weight. The gallery lights were on, their cold fluorescence casting harsh reflections on the polished floor. The canvases hung in their usual places, blank and pristine, as if nothing had happened. But the air was still heavy, vibrating faintly with the same low hum that had followed me all night. I glanced at the clock and felt my stomach twist. The gallery would open in minutes, and I hadn't left. My legs wobbled as I pushed myself upright, my knees threatening to give way. My hands were trembling, slick with sweat, and when I wiped them on my pants, I noticed faint red streaks, blood. My nails had bitten into my palms, deep enough to break skin. I hadn't even felt it. I turned to face the canvases, my reflection faint and distorted in their blank surfaces. They stared back at me, silent but alive, their presence pressing down on my chest like a hand squeezing my heart. The gallery would open soon. Guests would come. They'd stand where I was now, gazing at the blank surfaces, whispering about the divine. The door creaked open behind me, breaking the silence.
Still here?
Hastings' voice cut through the haze, casual, amused.
You've been acting strange lately.
I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, the taste of metal still thick on my tongue. My gaze remained fixed on the canvases. Hastings stepped beside me, his sharp suit pristine, his hands tucked into his pockets.
Gotta hand it to that artist,
he said, tilting his head toward the paintings.
3 blank canvases, sold for a fortune. Can you believe that?
I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, my throat tightening. He was looking at the canvases, a smirk tugging at the edges of his mouth.
You know what I see when I look at these?
He chuckled, tapping the frame of number 1.
Money. That's all this is, and frankly, it's all it needs to be.
I swallowed hard, my voice cracking when I finally spoke. You don't see anything? He laughed again, louder this time.
Anything? No, of course not. They're blank.
He turned to leave, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor.
That's what you're supposed to see. Blank canvases, piles of cash. It's that simple.
He waved a hand dismissively as he disappeared through the door.
Anyway, don't stay here all day.
The door shut, and I was alone again. I turned back to the paintings. My reflection stared back at me. But I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was looking at them. The figures were still there, still watching. The eyes burned into me impossibly bright, their gaze heavy with knowing. The mouths stretched into wide, smudged grins. They weren't moving anymore, but their presence was no less oppressive. I sank to my knees, the weight of their gaze pulling me down, my chest tightening with each breath. My hands shook as I clasped them together, my skin cold and clammy. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear the canvases from the walls, but I couldn't move. All I could do was pray. Pray that the visions would fade. Pray that I would forget. Pray that the canvases would go back to being blank. But I knew better. They weren't blank. Not anymore. Not to me.